All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this last webinar for this academic year. So, of the webinar series on researching the far right method and ethics. So, this webinar is coordinated by the Reactionary Politics Research Network, the Center for Alternative to Social and Economic Inequalities, and the Center for Research on Extremism. This webinar series, as you may know, or may not know actually, aims to initiate and facilitate a discussion about the challenges that arise when researching far-right parties, protest movement, and violent actions, with a particular focus on the methodological and ethical challenges. So the topic addressed in this edition of the webinar series are based on the volume The Ethics of Researching the Far Right, Critical Approaches and Reflection, edited by Antonia Vaughan, Joanne Brown, Megan Tisley, and Aurélien Mondon. And my name is Audrey Gagnon, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa, and I will be moderating this webinar. So today's webinar will focus on the theme and issues covered in part 6 of the Ethics of Researching the Far Right. So that is ethics and activism, knowledge production, and dissemination. So at a time when the resurgence of the far right is putting many communities at risk, this webinar aims to reflect on the role of scholars of the far right. So the author presenting today will examine the ethics of engaging with policymakers within the context of racialized and Islamophobic approaches to countering violent extremism. They will also call for rethinking the terminology of far-right studies and decolonizing the field. And they will discuss the ethics of talking about the far-right, so in a way to limit normalization of far-right discourses. So the speaker will discuss and reflect on these issues using example on their research and personal experiences conducting it. So let me first present our panelists. So first we will have a presentation by Richard McNeill Wilson on policy making and ethics. Then this will be followed by a presentation by Isis Giraldo on knowledge production and by Cathy Brown on dissemination. So each of them will discuss during 15-20 minutes, and then this will be followed by a discussion and a Q&A session. So please, if you have any question at any time during the webinar, you can write them down in the Q&A section, so not in the chat, and then we will address them at the end of the webinar. So I will first present Richard while he shares his screen for his presentation. So Richard is a lecturer, assistant professor in Global Muslim Studies at the Alawaled Center Islamic Middle East Studies at the University of Edinburgh. He has formerly held postdoctoral position at Leiden University and the European University Institute, which included a Max Weber Fellowship from the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, as well as visiting fellowship at the universities of Cambridge, Harris, and Scuola Normale Superiore. He specializes in critical approaches to counterterrorism and counter-extremism, including research on contentious activism, Islamophobia, and state repression in a European context. So Richard, you can share your screen and you can start your presentation whenever you're ready.
So I'll be looking at this is part of a chapter on critically examining the role of the scholar in policymaking and the far right. It was written by myself and two colleagues, Michael Zeller and Michael Vaughan. And we were particularly interested in kind of understanding that where scholarship and where policy meet, and some of the problems and some of the issues around that kind of meeting place. So I wanted to kind of talk over the next 20 minutes or so. I want to just talk in kind of three sections. Firstly, looking at where policy and academia meet, and thinking about in the context of the development of this chapter and the discussion that we had in the chapter, where the researcher sits in the context of policy making and particularly in the context of ethics. And finally, how and when do we respond? So looking at four questions of ethical engagement and policymaking that can help us engage with policymaking as academics in an ethical way. As I said, I do have some slides, so apologies if I'll try and kind of make sure that it's easily transferable without any slides. So first of all, putting this into context, I want to contextualize the chapter, where that kind of came from. And that came out of, I think, thinking about this, I kind of thought about three events which helped to shape how I think about this discussion around the meeting of policy and academia. And I'm going to just talk through three of them to provide a little bit of context, going chronologically backwards, starting from an event actually that happened last week that I thought was quite useful to draw upon. At the University of Edinburgh, we've got a partnership with the University of Leiden, one of my former universities, And we've got an exchange program bringing students back and forth. And as part of that program, we're also looking at the Mediterranean, but we're also looking at policy and understanding policy in the context of the Mediterranean. Looking at kind of big structural inequalities, looking at the echoes of colonialism, looking at migration, and engaging with policymakers, particularly on a European level, on how to address some of these inequalities, address some of these issues. Now, what was really interesting about what happened over the last few weeks in terms of that exchange was a lot of students struggled quite correctly, quite rightly. They struggled thinking about how to put these kind of grand narratives and these grand issues around colonialism, around inequality, around structural racism, around capitalism, around migration into a policy context, into kind of small policy recommendations. Particularly, they also be implicated in those processes of inequality, of structural violence. And so it was very difficult. You know, I feel like much of the exchange was just kind of taking place with these big kind of structural issues that we understand down onto a policy level where policymakers want small individual not easy, but kind of they want answers to questions, right? It's whereas academics feel we create a lot of questions rather than finding answers. Policymakers want answers, right? And this is sometimes a difficult thing to match up to bring the two levels together. Now, also this chapter, going to a second event a couple of years ago, this chapter came really out of some direct engagement with the European Commission. So I was doing some work, some advising directly for the European Commission because they were looking to find a definition of violent right wing extremism, a definition of the far right, having not really had one. And this was in a post.
Is everything all right, Richard? We can still
Hi,
see you.
sorry, are you still there?
Yeah.
No.
I feel like we have a connection problem on.
Hi, I'm so sorry. Yes, it didn't exist until now, so I don't know what's. Can you still hear me? Okay.
Yeah, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I'm so sorry. I'll try and I'll try and work through it. So in 2009 attack, um, there was a requirement by the European Commission and the EU to come up with a definition of violent right-wing extremism and to think about online as well, because there was a big online component of the 2019 Christchurch attack. So I was working directly with the European Commission. My colleagues, Michael Zeller and Michael Vaughan, were also doing some work as well. And we realized there was a lot of problems in terms of engaging with the European Commission directly around the far right, around discussions of the far right, because there were various actors that were coming from different political positions, including governments on a European level who had to some extent sort of positively engaged with the far right or were kind of far right adjacent in some of their policies and some of their language. And that's a problem, of course, that we see right now, of course, within Europe as well, and within other countries within the global north. So we were struggling with some of these issues of how we create and again be kind of true to the research that we have, whilst at the same time engaging with policymakers that may not be engaging entirely honestly or in a context where they themselves may be implicated within the far right and within the kind of the promotion or the mainstreaming of the far right. And finally, another thing that kind of helped to inform some of this discussion was a lot of the research that I do, a lot of the research that I've done, engaged directly with far right actors, with individuals. Right, the research that I do is I'm not quantitative. I'm not really a political science. I'm more of a sociologist and a kind of an area scientist because I really like to engage directly and have interviews with individuals who are within this context of extremism, of terrorism. So groups who have been labeled extremist, individuals who have been labeled extremist, groups who have been prescribed as being terrorists. You know, what's the story? What's the discussion that we can get from them in kind of understanding their perspective and their experiences, and how do we bring that into research. So these sort of three events are in my mind now, and have helped to kind of inform. Some of these have helped to inform the chapter as well, and ongoing discussions. Um, Thinking about whether researcher exists within this context, therefore, there's an awful lot of moving parts and an awful lot of sometimes kind of quite contradictory um, flows and things that we need to think about when we engage with policymakers. And a lot of this is around discussion on ethics. So how do we conceptualize the kind of ethics that we have in order to conduct research? Because they become quite complex when we also add policy into the mix, and an already kind of quite complex means of engaging with the far right is complexified by also engaging with policy on top. And so there's roughly, I mean, sort of thinking this through, there's roughly four levels of ethics to think about as a researcher engaging with the far right and engaging with policy at some point. Now, first of all, there's ethics to yourself as a researcher, and we're operating in a context where there is a concern about an increasing far right and a mainstreaming of the far right. And as researchers, we come with certain ethics and ethical views, which we should do, and we have our own personal ethics in relation to far right mobilization. I assume that, speaking to you today, that we're operating in a context where we are anti-far right mobilization, and as researchers, we come to that wanting to respond to concern over far right mobilization. So we have our own personal ethics that we need to pay attention to, that we bring our positionality within this discussion. However, of course, within that context, we also have a level of ethics that applies to the researched community that we're looking at. If we are engaging directly with far right actors, with far right activists, which I feel that we should do as researchers, I feel that's an important process that we should be trying to do as a good researcher, as finding good primary research. There are questions over how we make sure that we engage with those individuals, right? When we go out and we conduct research, we should be making sure that we are putting in safeguards to protect the community that we're researching, even if we disagree with that community. Now, a lot of the research, of course, diverging off into ethics, which I really like talking about, the specific ethics of research. A lot of the ethics that we currently have around research comes from within social science, comes from hard sciences, proper sciences, and within hard sciences, a lot of that comes from the Helsinki Declaration, and an approach which prioritizes the well-being of the research subject within that process. That's great. That's great within certain settings, but within social sciences, it's a little bit more complex, of course, because the power dynamics is not always. It's not always the case that the researcher is the one that will harm the research community. That's a big discussion to be had. But within the context of conducting interviews with social scientists within a social science setting, we do need to make sure that we are putting in mechanisms of care and ethics towards the research community, including to those that make sure that we don't create harm amongst that community. Which, of course, somewhat conflicts with discussions around your personal ethics in relation to far right mobilization. Now, part of that ethical, aside from having research ethics to yourself, your own personal beliefs, and to the researched community, we also have ethics to the scholarly community. So there are individuals, of course, that have gone out and done slightly dodgy or very dodgy research, where they've kind of dressed up and hidden their identity and gone into far right communities and got data and taken it away, in a bit like this kind of colonial style of a hunter going in and bringing back a rare species of animal, right? It's a very kind of parasitic process. This is not good research ethics, right? We have ethics to the scholarly community that we need to look after to ensure that we do it correctly. We go out into far right communities if we are engaging with them and wanting to conduct interviews, and we're doing that in a way that is ethically good, and that also makes sure that future research into those communities is able to happen, right? That we're not burning our bridges and we're not burning the research community in doing that. Because if, as a far right actor, you're on the receiving end of some dodgy research, then you don't want to go and speak to researchers in the future, right? So we have a duty of care to the scholarly community. And finally, we have a duty of care in relation to the state, not to the state. Our ethics are not the same as that of the state. Often they differ. But we have ethical care in terms of relation to the state, to think about what is the impact of research on practices of state securitization and racialization. And this is a criticism that I've had for a long time, and I think it's getting better, but it's still a long way to go of a lot of research into the far right, which tends to assume that anything that is anti-far right is good. And coming from a background where I've done a lot of research into the problems of counterterrorism and the problems of counter-extremism and the impact of securitization on minority communities, but also as well on discussions of gender, on civil rights, on human rights, on democratic rights, I have seen consistently from elements of researchers that anything that is anti-far right must be good because it's anti-far right, without that reflection on, is this advancing securitization that may impact negatively on other communities? So all of these levels of ethics, to yourself in terms of being anti-far right, to the research community and wanting to protect your interviewees, to the scholarly communities to wanting to protect academia, and in relation to the state where you're very critical of these kind of securitized approaches towards the far right, are often conflicting ethics that we have to navigate in some way. And these ethics are made particularly difficult when, moving on to the final section, on how and when we engage with policymaking and policymakers, because it adds several more kind of layers and complexities to this existing ethical discussion. So as part of the chapter, just to sum up what we kind of did with the chapter, we had this discussion on policymaking, on far right research, on securitization of counter-extremism and counter-terrorism. And we came up with 4 questions that researchers can ask themselves in order to navigate some of these discussions. And again, these are imperfect questions, but they help with the kind of the reflexive process on this. So firstly, a first question to ask yourself with the potential for engagement with policy is my research honest when I'm engaging with policymakers? And this includes thinking about honest priorities, in terms of thinking about what are the priorities of academics and do they match with the priorities of governmental actors? Thinking as well about, within academia, we have peer review processes. Theoretically, we should share the same priorities around research integrity, which may not be reflected in the way government actors operate. So how do we think about bridging those priorities? How do we think about the government? To what extent is the government honest within this scenario? Does the government stance on the far right, for instance, encumber policymaking? Has the government been conducting activities or using policy or language that helps to lean into the far right? And what's the implication, therefore, of engaging with the government and policymakers on far right policymaking? What's the transparency in terms of thinking about this research honesty? What's the transparency of the government? Government actors may lack transparency, particularly around sensitive topics. One example, for instance, is the European Commission. When you're engaging with the European Commission, the findings and the projects are owned and withheld by the European Commission. So they may prevent publication, they may withhold kind of public discussion on this. What's the implication for that transparency discussion? And also in terms of evaluating the research honesty, what's the dissemination? So how will the deliverables be handled and disseminated? Is it possible to publish and share data analysis from this cooperation with a government actor in policymaking? Is the research subject to review and criticism? And how and should this be disseminated amongst wider research communities and the general public? The second question we can ask ourselves as researchers thinking about engaging with policymakers is who benefits and who bears risk from this engagement? So is there a risk? There is a potential risk to a research subject as part of this, right? Even in research that's already been done and already been finished. If I've gone to a far right community, if I've engaged with them, and if I've engaged with them honestly, yeah, through a kind of a do no harm context, an ethical context, is it then correct for me to take those findings and to use them in a policy context which is anti-far right? And how do I navigate that? How do I navigate that engagement? What is the kind of the risks in terms of accountability? And so policymakers, for instance, contain the potential to reduce the direct harms of hate speech and the indirect harms resulting from far right mobilization, which is a good thing. But this also risks reinforcing a shift in the regulation of speech towards, for instance, for profit tech corporations or to illiberal states with a lesser transparency or accountability. So, thinking about that element of accountability and risk. And finally, in terms of thinking about who benefits and who bears risks, what is the risk to the public and particularly to marginalized groups, with there being a potential for state or state sponsored violence to be used against communities, particularly against minorities or marginalized groups. The third question that we should ask ourselves as researchers is, what are the costs of participation and non-participation? So is there a cost to engaging in research? For instance, is there a cost to ourselves? Will our focus on this mean that we'll have to underexplore or unexplore other areas? And how can we think about those other areas that won't be explored as part of this policy engagement? Is there a risk or a cost of co-option if we're taking part in a project by policymakers, by a government? Is there a risk of that being co-opted into government paradigms, which will likely reduce the capacity for scholars to act as critical agents towards policy? That's the cost of participation, but is there also a cost of non-participation? So if we don't engage with policymakers, if we try and keep our hands clean, we say we're not going to kind of engage with policymakers on that level, is there a risk that policymakers will instead engage with non-critical research experts, or not engage with researchers at all, academic researchers at all? And what's the implications of that over time? And also, is there a cost to policymakers by not engaging? So researchers, as a researcher in the policy field, we actually have a lot more freedom and independence to challenge policy and to challenge perceived assumptions that policymakers often don't have because they exist within a hierarchy of policymaking. And finally, the final question we can ask ourselves is, what kind of incentives are affecting my decision to engage with policy and policy making? As researchers, I'm sure across international context, right, we're encouraged to have impact and to have kind of transfer activities which demonstrate high impact. Part of this impact can be gained from working with governments, working with policy, and the highest impact we can get is working with the most powerful actors. But these actors are also most easily able to dictate the terms of any research collaboration and to reproduce patterns of domination. Is there a risk as well that we could decide to disengage later? So what are the processes of potentially disengagement with a policy or research program? And if we disengage later, that will also mean that we have greater costs of withdrawal. And a lot of this, of course, discussion takes place in the context of hindsight. So how can we think about that? How can we think about what might only be available to us in hindsight in terms of the final outcomes of the policy, how the research agenda and that of our work help to drive the field and to drive policy over time that may be unexplored at earlier stages. Ultimately, just to sum up, these discussions around the ethics of engagement with policymakers should be treated as a set of ongoing questions rather than a preliminary screening test. But in that very academic way, to kind of move away from policy slightly, in that very academic way, what it does is it helps us to ask questions. And I think just by being aware of some of these questions, having some of this context there, it helps us to start to navigate how we engage with policy making, how we engage as far right researchers in context of policy making, which may be problematic in various ways. Thank you very much, and sorry for the problems at the beginning.
No worries. Thank you so much, Richard. I think you give us a very good illustration that we do not need a PowerPoint to make a good presentation. And
That's very kind.
and I'm really glad that we had you today because for those who have been following this webinar series, we had a few discussion on the ethics of researching the far right. So thinking about care and ethics for the researcher themselves, how to protect ourselves, but we never really addressed this issue of engaging with policymakers. So I think that was an important conversation to have. So I'm glad that we started this conversation. So for the next presentation, we have Isis Giraldo. So you can. Oh no, you don't have a PowerPoint. So I'll just introduce her, and then I will leave the Zooms to you. So she is a junior lecturer at the English department of the University of Lausanne, where she teaches US literature and New American Studies. So her work belongs within the fields of cultural and media studies from approaches that recenter powers and justice. Empirically, it focuses on Colombia and aims at showing how mass media has helped maintain hegemony over stark imbalances of power along the axis of gender, race, and social class. So our work aims at connecting Northern feminist theories, cultural studies, and post-colonial studies with critical thought on gender, race, and coloniality as developed from within Latin America. So is this, I leave you the Zoom.
Well, thank you very much, Audrey, for the invitation, and thank you, Richard, for the great talk. So I don't have a PowerPoint, and I hope to be as engaging as Richard. I do have a presentation that has two parts. The first one is the context, and the second part is about how the context informs the framework. And I need to spend quite some time about the context because I know that usually audiences in the global north know very little about contexts from outside the global north, which is at the heart of the question. So I come from, as you said, Audrey, I come from the field of literary studies and cultural studies. And I am interested in culture, representation, and the relationship between power and culture. And I actually landed in far-right studies because of the empirical research I was carrying out for my PhD thesis and later for my book. That's what took me here. So I didn't start with my idea was not to start to contribute to far-right studies. This empirical research, so the corpus I was investigating for my PhD thesis and my book, was media culture in 21st century Colombia from a long-term historical perspective. And I must say here that Colombia is a very, it's a big country, not only in geographical terms, it's twice as big as France, but also there are many different indigenous groups that have been resisting for more than 5 centuries Western colonization, but also different, it's heterogeneous in racial terms, and also in terms of local culture. So when I'm talking about Colombia, I am referring about urban Colombia, not the rural communities and all these other areas in Colombia where we have different forms of social organization. I'm talking about Colombia as a dominant, from the dominant perspective. So the underlying question in my work, which I came to ask at the end of the project, actually, I realized that I was asking this question, was why was the urban Colombian mainstream located so far to the right? And I'd like to specify from the start that I'm using the working definition of right wing that I'm using is Corey Robin, where right wing, to be right wing implies a degree of resistance to the emancipation of subordinate groups. And the far would be, the greater the resistance, the farthest to the right. So this is a question, a long-term question that I have had since the early 90s. I'm originally from Colombia, but I have been living in Europe for half my life. But in the 90s, I was doing my first undergrad degree at a private university in the industrial capital of Colombia, where the elite used to send their children. And my classmates at the time and my teachers at the time all supported the far-right violence of paramilitaries. So if you were to read the essay in the book that I was invited to talk about today, I decided to open with a very crude description of one of the massacres these paramilitaries perpetrated in early 2000. And I wanted to go into detail about this because it was my kind of rhetorical strategy to appeal to affect and then to appeal to logos. So show you the extent, of how, extreme this far rightness is, and then to start, going backwards and saying, okay, but we don't speak, we usually don't speak of this in the context of Colombia as being far right. So paramilitaries, for those of you, probably you're not familiar, probably you have read about guerrilla groups in Colombia, but less about paramilitaries. These are anti-popular death squads that were created, that emerged in the 1940s, and they were created and sponsored by the entrepreneurial class, the elites, and the Colombian states. And they have been, mutating for the last, since the late 40s up to the present. The characteristic of these groups, one of the characteristics, apart from being anti-popular, the characteristic of these groups is that they deploy extreme violence. And by extreme violence, I mean to say that they were the ones who invented, I don't know if you've watched Hollywood films in the 80s about drug trafficking or gangs. You will heard of the Colombian necktie, so which is a type of body cut that where your throat is cut and the tongue is taken out. So this was invented among other human cuts by the paramilitaries, the Colombian paramilitaries in the 40s. During the 90s, they established dismembering schools, and they used to use the chainsaw as one of the murdering weapons. So this is the kind of violence we are talking about. And of course, the violence has been exclusively directed towards the region of the earth, that is rural and indigenous communities or Black communities, social outcasts, poor people, homeless people, disabled people. This far-right violence that has been established in Colombia for decades has fulfilled two functions. One that is symbolic, and it constructs the individual located in the wrong social space as a citizen abject, that is, a rightful citizen of Colombia without rights, without citizen rights. This individual stands in opposition to the citizen subject, who is the one with the right to claim rights. In a way, the notion of that's part of the argument I have been making in my work, is the notion of citizenship in Colombia is cross-cut by these social spaces that individuals inhabit. The second function of this extreme violence has been instrumental because it has ensured a never-ending internal colonialism, that is the appropriation of lands and resources for capitalist exploitation. Because as I said, Colombia is not also very big, but it's a very rich country in terms of resources. And the second effect in terms, the second instrumental function has been the decimation of trade unions, which has ensured that workers' rights in Colombia are kept to a minimum. Up to 2013, at least, Colombia used to be the most dangerous country in the world for trade unionism. So the perpetration of this type of violence across time has been made possible because it effectively operated in the realm of discourse and in connection with a specific affective economy of the political. In this regard, a number of terms have been deployed in the Colombian context. The citizen subject has been historically denoted as the fine citizen, and this is a word that is, discussed in the public sphere, in the political, by political actors, by media actors. In Spanish is el ciudadano de bien, the fine citizenry or the fine citizen, and it emerges as the entrepreneur. Whereas the citizen object has been denoted variously across the decades as the liberal or the basilisk in the 50s, the communist from the 50s until the turn of the century, the terrorist since 2001 when the Colombian government aligned with Bush, with the US terminology of the war on terror, and the Castrochavista, which is a term that was coined in 2018. So it's the same, different tropes to identify the citizen object. While the citizen subject has been constructed in Colombia, in the Colombian imaginary, as one that deserves empathy, admiration, respect, and protection, the citizen object has been historically constructed via those different tropes as disgusting, hateful, and deserving of a horrible death. So the specific organization of the discursive field and affective economy for decades allowed for the arrival to the presidency of a man, Álvaro Uribe, in 2002, whose links with paramilitaries were an open secret in Colombia. And he managed to get to the presidency with the presidents with a program focused on elitism and anti-popular state terrorism. So accordingly, it was during the government of Uribe that a policy which I like to denote as state mass murder of poor civilians in the name of the security of the middle and the upper classes was put into place. Between 2002 and 2010, at least 6,400 people, poor or very poor men, were murdered by the Colombian armed forces. This case came to be known as the falsos positivos, and it came to light in 2007. However, when Uribe finished his mandate in 2010, he ended with 67% of approval rates. And his designated successor, who was Minister of Defense during the case, was elected president in 2010. So the question is, how come a majority of urban Colombian people vote for someone who was behind such a policy of state murder? So by all standards, Uribe was as nefarious as Bolsonaro in Brazil. Yet in the global north, for European governments, the US, and prestigious higher education institutions such as the University of Oxford, who invited him as a lecturer for a while, or the ELSE, who also invited him to lecture the students in London about his good, he was presented as a good example of governance in the so-called developing world. And I'm talking about 2011, that is 4 years after the case was, made public and everyone knew about it. So my empirical work in Colombia, which I just briefly summarized, allowed me to claim, I summarized the case, allowed me to claim that what Colombia had for a long time been a textbook case of how to attain and maintain consent on far-right sensibilities and policies, the term far-right has been, until very recently, rarely used in relation to Colombia. And Colombia is usually left aside when we speak of the far-right. We speak of Brazil, we speak of India, but Colombia is usually left aside. This in turn made me start a reflection on what Walter Mignolo has termed the geopolitics of knowledge, a concept that covers various aspects, including the fact that the global north, the West, must always be the default baseline for a topic to be of interest or a field to emerge as such. This has been revealed in extremis, at least this is part of my claim, in what concerned the study of the 21st century far right. I defended my PhD thesis in 2017, just a few months after Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. A fitting alternative title for my thesis could have been The Semiotics of the Colombian Far-Right Structure of Feeling, Aspects of a Long-Term Successful Story. Moreover, back in 2015, US Army General John Kelly argued, and I am quoting him, that Colombia had proven to the world that the battle for the narrative was the most important of all. So this was pre-Donald Trump and pre the rise of the far right. So how context informs framework? You certainly know the things I'm going to mention next. But since this was the goal of my piece, and since I'm taking the Colombian case as point of departure, I'm going to go through it. So all the elements that I listed above inform my contribution for the collection, The Ethics of Researching the Far Right. And my contribution was titled The Far Right from the Underside of History, Decolonizing Far Right Studies. And I'd like to unpack the title. So by the underside of history, that's a Latin American decolonial phrasing that responds to the claim that non-European peoples have no history. So my objective was to recenter a pioneer case in the 21st century in which far-right sensibilities and policies were mainstream, were supported by the West, and were subsequently ignored by the West when right-wing studies becomes a thing. But decolonize, more frequently than not, is taken to be synonymous with diversify, and emerges as including non-European Western examples within global accounts of a phenomenon whose analytical frameworks and terminologies are still European or Western. This was not the intention of my piece, and is neither the approach I try to take. What I wanted to do is to take the Colombian case to interrogate the framework, structures, assumptions, and terminologies of what by 2022 was becoming the mainstream in regards to studying the far right. This was, of course, informed by works such as Charles Mill's Black Rights, White Wrongs, and his engagement with how the political history of the West is sanitized and reconstructed as if racial domination had not been central to it. A decolonial epistemological shift in framework involves, first, to understand that the post-1492 world was one that is thoroughly global and in which racial hierarchical structuring goes hand in hand with the colonial enterprise, which didn't start in the 19th century, but in the 15th century, at the end of the 15th century, when the Spanish and the Portuguese landed in Latin America, what is now known now like Latin America. So second, it involves to recognize that coloniality keeps operating in the post-colonial world. In my specific case, the Colombian case, both ongoing imperialism and the geopolitics of knowledge helped downplay the far-rightness of Colombian democracy. And this is very important because Colombia is, in theory, the longest democracy of Latin America. It's the only country that hasn't had a proper dictatorship, as was the case of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, you name it. In fact, the CIA and the US never had to stage a coup because local Creole elites had, since the 19th century, been very effective in keeping the mainstream very much at the right end of the spectrum. This, of course, has had nefarious effects for the wretched of Colombia. Also, as a pioneer case, Colombia offered early on some openings for challenging what was arguably become the mainstream populist lens to approach the phenomenon. While in the British context, political scientists such as Aurélien Mondon, Aaron Winter, and Cathy Brown have for some time been now challenging such approach. There are others. Populism still remains the dominant lens in this respect. Uribe was never considered a populist, nor by scholars, neither by the local or global media reporting on his government. His program was read as a strong yet non-ideological approach to governance. Moreover, and this is my own reading, he deployed and performed elitism in very explicit ways. And this, I think, is an aspect, the question of elitism is an aspect that is at stake in what concerns far-right ideology currently, but is not much mentioned in Western contexts. It is either, obscured by means of populism or by means of nationalism, which should be actually ethno-nationalism and other little, rhetorical terms that are deployed to discuss the far right in the media, but also in scholarly contexts. Uribe was also very successful at establishing neoliberalism qua democracy So there's this kind of chain of equivalence between democracy that emerges is actually liberal democracy, but we speak of democracy, and it's made to be equivalent to neoliberalism in a way that implied that any challenge to neoliberalism was read as a challenge to democracy. And he was extremely effective in doing that. And I do think this is also at play in contexts in the global north. A final point that I think the Colombian case illuminates has to do with the terms that are scholarly accepted to denote figures, parties, and policies in the global north. The decades-long far-right anti-popular bloodbath in Colombia has been made possible, fueled, and sponsored by US governments across the aisle. The Plan Colombia, a $1.3 billion package granted by the US in 1999 to the Colombian government, paved the way for the two decades-long state violence that under Álvaro Uribe implemented. This plan was signed and supported by a Democrat, Bill Clinton. Yet, time and again, I find myself arguing most recently 2 weeks ago, with US scholars who want to make me understand that the US Democrats are on the left and can by no means be denoted as far right. It is my contention, and today also, that also they want to explain me that when it comes to the United States, one must distinguish between domestic and foreign policy. It is my contention, and today my conclusion, that such a division can only produce shaky, incomplete, sanitized, non-based on evidence scholarly analysis. Additionally, it is ethically suspect since it inherently adopts a colonial imperial hierarchical racial structuring that places US citizens as fully humans and the rest of us as not quite humans. Another way of saying this is that it aligns the analytical tools with the political goals of the object of study, thus contributing to its rhetorical and political work. And I'm done.
Thank you so much, Isis, for this great presentation. And I firmly believe that there are not enough call for decolonizing the field of far-right studies, so your contribution is very much welcome in this webinar series. So for our next and last presentation, we have Katie Brown. So she is a research fellow in language and social justice at Manchester Metropolitan University, and her research focuses on the mainstreaming of the far right, centering principally on the role that mainstream actors from politics and media play in normalizing far right discourse. So prior to her current role at Manchester Metropolitan University, she completed her PhD on far right mainstreaming during the Brexit referendum at the University of Bath. So Katie, I see that you've already shared your screen, so I will leave you to it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much to the organisers and the other presenters for their great presentations. So yeah, my main research interest is in the process of mainstreaming, so how far-right politics becomes normalised, and especially through the role that mainstream actors play. So when writing the chapter for this ethics book, I wanted to reflect a bit on the potential role that academics might play in this mainstreaming process. There are obviously some much more obvious contributors, politicians, parties, media outlets who have huge platforms to contribute to the process. And obviously as academics, we don't have that level of reach by any means. But we are often seen as respected sources of information, which means that we have a responsibility to reflect on what we're communicating about this subject and the potential impact that it could have. And before I go into it, I just wanted to say an important note that the issues that I'm raising in this presentation are not simply an individual level problem. Clearly, they stem from structural and institutional pressures and priorities. And I just published an article with Antonia Vaughan about how neoliberal academia incentivizes problematic practices in relation to this subject. So while today I'm encouraging us all to reflect a bit on our own practices, they're not individual failings, and like the task is to build collective ways of addressing them. So now I'll just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to cover in this presentation. I'm first going to outline the broad approach that we can take in this kind of research with unashamed political commitment, and really thinking about the kinds of reflexivity we should engage in. I'll then go over briefly our understanding of what mainstreaming is and the ideas of talking with and talking about the far right. And finally, I'll think a bit about how academia can play into those dynamics and the kinds of questions we can ask ourselves to try to make conscious ethical choices in this field. So when working in this field, there's obviously a general consensus that far-right politics is on the rise, and you see that repeated in the media as well. And certainly there's been many examples of this rise in different contexts and formats over recent years. But alongside these political developments, we've seen a massive growth of interest in the far right within academia. If you look at the graph on the slide, you can see how the number of articles published on this topic has skyrocketed over recent years. In a sense, this can be in response to the developments that we've seen, but other research has shown that this topic does attract disproportionate attention compared to other kinds of political parties. So it's a real area of growing interest that only seems to be expanding. And with all these articles that are being produced to give us insights into this form of politics, there's a real need to ensure that we aren't contributing to the dynamics that we're describing. And this attention that the far right has received within the field is not matched by levels of engagement with the ethical implications of doing this research. And the book that was published and events like this one show that these conversations are beginning to happen, but I think there's still a long way to go with this. And before I go into the specifics of our reflections on this topic, I just want to outline the kind of approach that is crucial to ethical engagement in this field. So within political science, in training as political scientists, there's clearly the legacies of positivism and this idea that we should be pursuing objective inquiry. So they're held as the benchmarks of rigorous and reliable research. But I think if we are really to reflect seriously on the responsibility we have as researchers, we need to not only reject the plausibility of neutrality, but its desirability too. Because even in fields where there's an acceptance that objectivity is not possible, it still feels like we're encouraged to almost apologize for not being able to quite be objective. But in more radical traditions like the critical anti-racist feminist and decolonial scholarship, there are really excellent critiques of this idea of objectivity and its desirability. For instance, showing how it's been used to uphold white supremacy, privilege Western thought over others, and placing white men's experiences as universal. So in line with those critiques, we need to stand firm and unashamed in our political stance. When we're faced with injustice, which far-right politics is always entangled with, this kind of position is a necessity because there is no neutral position towards exclusion and oppression. So drawing on the work of Remy Joseph Salisbury and Laura Connolly, political commitment is not something that we should be apologizing for or trying to minimize, because it's actually very necessary when we are approaching topics like the far right, racism, and its mainstreaming. And there's also real analytical value in being political. If we are trying to approach the complexities of systems of oppression, we must absolutely start from an understanding of the inequalities embedded within them. So this is the kind of baseline for an ethical approach to our research in this field that's really crucial. So if we do accept that we are not and should not be neutral observers in the field of far-right studies or other areas, we need to engage with our positionality as researchers. And there is obviously a lot of discussion around positionality, especially in research that deals with human participants. But there's been a little bit less focus on positionality when we're not interviewing people, for example. And actually a great piece that was published since I wrote the chapter by Ghani and Khan, it challenges the use of positionality statements to where they are almost used to kind of get closer to objectivity, that you accept that you are flawed as an individual, but you're still trying to get to objectivity, and they reject that. So I think that's an important reflection to add. But in terms of approaching research reflexively, there are three broad questions that we can ask ourselves before, during, and after the research project. So the first of these is, what am I coming to the research with? So this question addresses the before phase of a project, taking into account our prior influences, characteristics, and motivations, which might influence the approach that we take from the outset. The second question is, how does this affect the way in which I conduct my research? And this consideration centers on the during phase of a project, reflecting on how the answer to the first question might continuously impact on the way that we're carrying out our research, how we continue with it, and how our analysis is interpreted. And the final question is, what am I leaving the field with? This deals with the after phase of research. So it evaluates the potential impact that a project may have, how it might be received, and what it could be used for. And it encourages us to think about the lasting effects of our work beyond the simple publication of findings. And all these three questions are obviously linked, and they need to be engaged with fully, all of them. But I'm going to focus on the last one, as I did in the chapter, because I think it's tended to receive a little less attention than the others. And when thinking about this final question, I argue that the lens of mainstreaming can help us to reflect on our role in the dynamics that we study. So we define mainstreaming as the process by which parties or actors, discourses and/or attitudes move from a position of unacceptability outside the norm to one of legitimacy within the norm. And these norms themselves are not fixed and are subject to discursive construction and reconstruction. I don't have time to go through all of that, or the framework that's on the slide. But I thought I'd talk about two kind of components that then help us to look at the role of academia. So mainstream is a dynamic and complex process that involves lots of different factors and intersecting components. But I think a lot of attention in the field has focused on the actions of the far right itself in bringing about its own normalization, which is a really important factor, definitely, and that we do need to study. But it's kind of drawn a lot of this attention towards the far right. So people have looked at how the far right has tried to appear more moderate, to seem more normal, to become part of the mainstream. So it's very important, but the focus of my research has more been on the role of so-called mainstream actors. So they're kind of the less obvious suspects in the mainstreaming process. So I've looked at mainstream politicians and political campaigns and traditional media outlets in the mainstreaming process. So how they might adopt similar issues to the far right, how they might talk about the far right to kind of position themselves as good in response. But I think, so there are lots of different groups that can be placed within this mainstream category. But I think one factor that is underexplored and quite often underestimated is the role that academia can play. And Jana Hoivert's work shows how politics, media, and academia intersect. So I think it's really important that we start to explore those dynamics. And to kind of capture the way that the mainstream can contribute to mainstreaming, I outlined two interrelated components of mainstream discourse. So that's talking with the far right and talking about the far right. So talking with refers to shared discourses between the mainstream and far right. That might be similar topics between them. It could be the same kinds of content, the style of the way that they put that across. So an example would be shared anti-immigration discourses in the UK at the moment. Both the previous Conservative government and the Labour government have adopted stronger and stronger policies and rhetoric against immigration. So you can see how there's these similarities with classic far-right talking points. Talking about refers to the way in which mainstream actors construct the far right. So that could be explicitly through direct references to them or implicitly through more subtle allusions. So for example, mainstream politicians might attempt to draw closer to the far right in certain instances, or quite often distance themselves from the far right by talking about them in different ways. So you can think of ideas like the cordon sanitaire, where there's this attempt to sort of say, oh, we're very much separate from the far right, but quite often those parties who will refuse to collaborate with the far right will still talk with them in quite a number of ways. And so both of these ideas go together and work hand in hand. And I think it's quite crucial to consider them because academia clearly talks about the far right a lot. Now, before I specifically deal with academia, I just wanted to give a couple of quick examples of how talking about the far right can talk with it too. And then I'll talk more specifically about academia. So on the left-hand side of the slide, this is an article from the Times newspaper in the UK that's talking about Marine Le Pen as a cat lover. And I mean, if you read the details of it, we're encouraged to think about Marine Le Pen as having this cuddly side rather than emphasizing the violence of her party and how it targets various minoritized communities. So we're talking about the far right in this particular way that then talks with, because we play down the deeply harmful effects of their politics. And then next to that is an article from The Guardian that was published last year. And this is an interview with former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. And here he's talking about the far right as bad because we need to tackle the rise of the far right, but talking with it by encouraging stronger anti-immigration measures, supposedly to then beat the far right. And that's the kind of ideas that we see repeated so often in media and political discourses. So you can see how those two dynamics come together through media and political discourse. So now moving to the question of academia. So academia's role in conveying and mediating people's understanding of political events means that we have a responsibility to talk about the far right in a way that doesn't talk with it. There are, of course, some people within the profession who now actively talk with the far right, and that's been a very deliberate choice. But in general, it's less obvious and deliberate than that. So with all this content that's being produced, as the graph shows, we need to reflect on what we're saying and the implications that it can have. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a few examples of how we might talk about the far right in ways that are potentially unhelpful or problematic. And that's why we kind of need to reflect on it a little bit more. So the first of these, amplification. This is about how when we talk about the far right so pervasively, so persistently, we can build excessive hype around it and overemphasize its importance. And I'm definitely not saying that we should abandon far right studies, but but we need to reframe how we situate these groups within the wider context, because there's a danger that we focus too much on the far right at the expense of looking at wider factors like the role of the mainstream. And it can feed into this idea that the far right is constantly on the rise. If we're talking about it incessantly, we feed into the idea that it is worthy of our attention. And this can in turn bleed into media hype around these groups as well. So when we talk about the far right, we need to also not talk about the far right as well. Euphemization is about the kinds of language that we use as well in our research. So there's been a lot of really great research on the way that populism has become synonymous with the far right in a lot of senses, and has become a euphemism where it's less negative and stigmatizing than more accurate descriptors. It is often used negatively, but far-right actors, for example, Marine Le Pen, Matteo Salvini, they've all embraced the term in different scenarios and claimed it for themselves. It sounds like it makes you popular. It's got connotations around popular support. So a quote from far-right politician Nigel Farage at the European Parliament, he said, "You may loathe populism, but I tell you a funny thing, it's becoming very popular and it has great benefits." If we think about other more accurate terms to describe the far right, you could not imagine Farage saying that about racism, for example. So populism as a term is able to be manipulated and claimed by the far right as positive. So if the far right are using it to be part of their desired image, we need to question as academics whether populism is the right term to be using in these scenarios, or if we should use something more accurate that doesn't feed into their desired image. And finally, before I conclude, exceptionalization. So this is how the way that we talk about the far right can place it as something that's well beyond the norm, that's far detached from the mainstream. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying about mainstreaming, where this focus on the far right and how they've sort of started to become normal, it places them as outside the norm in the first place, rather than considering the structural and institutional developments where the kinds of exclusion that they rely on are actually fundamental to the development of liberal democracy, for example. So there's often this idea that when the mainstream shifts, they're being pushed into positions that are unnatural to them, when actually history shows that there's long been complicity and the development of these very exclusions at the heart of the mainstream. So that means that we always need to situate our analysis of the far right within these broader contexts and not exceptionalize it as the only example of racism in society. So I'll just briefly conclude. So I think this discussion speaks more broadly to the responsibility that we have in consciously reflecting on these issues. Our ways of talking about the far right must not serve to legitimize it or further facilitate its mainstreaming or talk with it in any way. The decisions that we make when we talk about are numerous and they are complex. So there's no easy answers, but I think we need to work together to build better practices going forward. As a starting point, I propose that when we start to answer that third question of reflexivity, what am I leaving the field with? We start to engage with the concept of mainstreaming and we think about the power dynamics and interactions that are involved, and consider the messages that we are adding to those debates. So I've put a few questions that we can ask ourselves on the slide. Is this the most appropriate way to conceptualize this form of politics? Where am I suggesting that power lies? Which other groups are involved and who or what am I framing as the solution? Am I accounting for key factors which speak to its wider relevance and implications? Who is affected by this politics, and am I taking into account the impact? And how does my framing relate to the desired image of the far right and or mainstream in this scenario? And as I said at the beginning, this is not purely an individual issue. The pressure to publish, generate impact, and build a public profile that comes with neoliberal academia often run counter to these aims, particularly when job prospects are tied so closely to these measures. However, I think by working collectively towards an ethics of talking about, with an active and sustained rejection of talking with, we can hope to build effective strategies moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katie, for this amazing presentation and for raising such important question as well. I feel like we talk a lot about reflectivity during and before any research, but we don't talk about the after, what happens after. So thank you for that.